Evening. I want to talk with you this evening about a phrase that sometimes I hear. There's nothing wrong with the phrase. Sometimes I think maybe we have a misconception about the phrase. I suspect all of you have heard the phrase when talking about a particular congregation here or there, that they are a sound congregation. Or maybe you've heard that they are not a sound congregation. I'm going to talk about this idea of a sound congregation this evening with you and ask the question to begin with, what do we mean by a congregation being a sound congregation? What do we mean by that? I think, as I hear the phrase from time to time, the contexts in which I hear it and the evaluation of the answer, whether a certain congregation is sound or not, I think what comes to our mind, well, let me just ask you, when you hear someone ask, is that a sound congregation? So, just some congregation somewhere, not asking about any particular one. What comes to your mind as how you would decide to answer that question? I think, I may be wrong, but I think most of us, when we think about that question, we think in terms of the practices of that congregation and the practices of the people in that congregation. Things like whether they use instrumental music or not, whether they have a fellowship hall or a kitchen or something like that, whether they teach and practice the truth on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, whether they observe the Lord's Supper every first day of the week or not, whether the men lead within the assembly or whether women also lead within the assembly. I think that that's what comes to the mind of most brethren when they think about whether a congregation is a sound congregation or not. And if they get all those answers right in regard to a particular congregation, then therefore that's a sound congregation, and one therefore that's appropriate to meet with that church and worship with that church, be a member of that church. I want to ask you, what does the word sound mean? Now granted, most common use of the word sound is something that you hear, but in this sense, what does sound mean? Well, the word sound, aside from things that you hear, its kind of second meaning is something that is healthy, something that is in good condition, not affected by disease or weakness. So, when someone writes their will, I don't know if people really use this phrase, but being of sound mind and body. That their body is healthy, their mind is healthy, they're thinking straight when they write this will. That's what they're saying. They're not affected by, they're not somebody who's suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's and doesn't know what they're writing and isn't thinking clearly. That they are healthy and they're thinking straight about those things. So this word sound, its meaning is healthy, free from disease or weakness, free from error. So as we think about a congregation, maybe you're traveling and you're looking, hey, is there a sound congregation in this particular city? You ask that question. Is it good thinking to base the answer about a sound congregation just on these issues that I kind of outlined before, those kinds of questions? I'll suggest to you, as we begin this evening, that there are a lot of congregations. I'm not going to try to quantify how many there are or not. There are congregations that have all the right answers on there. They don't sing with instrumental music. They do have the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. They do teach and practice the truth on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And yet they're kind of dead. Have you seen congregations? Can you imagine congregation like that? They're doing the right things as far as doctrinal issues, as we use that phrase, but they're kind of dead. In Revelation chapter 2, we read about the church in Ephesus. We read the Lord's letter to the church in Ephesus. And there in chapter 2, we'll begin in verse 2. Revelation chapter 2, verse 2. Jesus, the Lord, writes this message, sends this message to the church in Ephesus. I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, and that you cannot endure evil men. And you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false. These are good things that they have done. And you have perseverance and have endured for my name's sake and have not grown weary. So that they're working hard at those kinds of things, at not enduring evil men. And when there's someone comes along and says they're an apostle, they put that person to the test. And if they're not, they find that person to be false. So they were good at those kinds of things. In verse 6, the Lord continues, this you do have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. We don't know a whole lot about the Nicolaitans and who the people were who followed this philosophy, but apparently, as best I can tell, these were people who claimed to be Christians. They were members of churches, but they ascribed to this philosophy that really enabled them to indulge the flesh. Kind of like some other groups in the first century who claimed Jesus and claimed to follow Jesus, but they had a very loose view of sin. And the Nicolaitans were apparently, from what I've read, a little bit like that. And the Lord praises the Ephesians for recognizing that kind of sin is not right, and we're not going to approve anybody who believes that way. And so he has said to them, you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. But verses 4 and 5. I have this against you, that you have left your first love. They were doing all of these things. They were doing them well, but they had lost their first love. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, and repent, and do the deeds you did at first, or else I'm coming to you, and will remove your lampstand out of its place, unless you repent. So this idea of losing your first love, that they're busy doing these things, getting those doctrinal issues right, but their heart is not there in the same way it had been in the beginning. They've left that first love. Or Revelation chapter 3 in the letter to Laodicea. The problem here, in fact, there's nothing good said about Laodicea, but they illustrate a problem for us. Verse 15, the Lord says to them, I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I would that you were cold or hot. You know, and he says in verse 16, so because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spit you out of my mouth. The area where the church in Laodicea was famous for its hot springs, the hot mineral water that flowed out of the ground just north of the city of Hierapolis and flowed down into Laodicea. And so they had hot water all the time. Didn't need water heaters. They just had hot water. And it was this mineral water that they treasured. And so Jesus uses the imagery of that to talk about them. They're not hot. They're not on fire for the Lord, we might say. But neither are they cold. It's not like they hate the Lord. There's no cold war between them and the Lord. But they're just lukewarm. Their heart isn't in it. So you have people who have left their first love. You have people who are lukewarm. You have some people who are just cold-hearted and wouldn't help a soul. You have people who are bitter. They may get all of those other issues right. Divorce and remarriage, you're only divorced for one reason. And if you've wrongfully divorced, you don't have a right to remarry somebody else and those kind of issues. And they may not use instrumental music and stand against that. And they may insist on having the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, as I believe the New Testament teaches us to do. and those various other issues, but still they're lukewarm, and they've lost their first love, and they're not really with the Lord at all. I think I've heard when somebody asks about, this, I'm traveling to such and such a city, can you recommend a congregation there? I'm looking for a sound congregation. And I think I've heard people answer from time to time, well, there's this congregation that they're sound, but they're kind of dead. Remember what sound means. Healthy, free of disease. They're sound, but they're dead. Doesn't work. This idea that if we get these doctrinal issues right, we're all good, and we can be satisfied with that, and we're healthy. No, we're not healthy, if that's the situation. If we, we may have all the doctrinal issues right, but we're lukewarm, we've left our first love. I think that's bad thinking, to base soundness just on doctrinal issues. I think that's bad thinking. It's basing soundness only on external issues without regard to the heart. Granted, external issues are easier to measure. It's much easier to look at a congregation and say, do they observe the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? Yes, they do. Do they teach the truth on marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Yeah, I've been there. I've heard them teach on that. And they've taken a stand on that. Do they stand against the Nicolaitans? Yeah, they stand against the Nicolaitans. When there's somebody claiming to be a false, well, nobody claims to be a false apostle. When somebody's claiming to be an apostle, the people there test that and say, no, you're not an apostle if they're in fact false apostles. Yeah, they won't stand for that kind of thing. It's easier to judge those kind of external things. Hearts are more difficult. Hearts require more careful evaluation. But which is more important? Or which is more basic to our service to the Lord? Maybe I should phrase it that way. Which is more basic to our service to the Lord? I think Jesus teaches, and we'll see where he teaches this in a moment. I think Jesus teaches that these matters of the heart are more basic to our service to the Lord than this next step of getting those doctrinal issues correct. Both are important, and we'll look at a passage that emphasizes that. In fact, it's the same passage as the previous point that I just made that we'll be looking at here in just a moment. But we need to realize that priority, that some things are more basic to whether we are sound or not than other things. Maybe not more important, but they are definitely more basic to whether we are truly sound or not. We need to realize that priority. Jesus was in regular contact with people in the first century who emphasized all those external things, the doctrinal things, but their hearts were no good at all. Who am I talking about? The Pharisees. That so well describes the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees. And what did Jesus think of them? Not much. When he looked at the lives of those Pharisees, he knew, he could see that those people were not the people of God. Those people were not sound, we might say. The Pharisees had other faults than this, but this was a major one. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23. This is this chapter where Jesus confronts so many of the mistakes of the scribes and the Pharisees. And he says over and over again in this chapter, woe unto you, you scribes and Pharisees, because of the many mistakes they made. We get down to verse 3 and verse 23, chapter 23, verse 23 of Matthew. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe. What does tithe mean? Well, that's the Old Testament law on contributing to the temple and to the Lord. They were to give a tenth of every of all of their profit, all of their gain. For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But those are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. Was it important that they tithe? You know, Jesus mentions these three things that they tithe: mint and dill and cumin. You know, when we think about our contribution, our generosity, our spirit to give, and we think about our level of income, and we think about, you know, here's my income, I kind of add up all of my income. Are you careful to include in that how many spices you picked out of your herb garden as part of your profit? I don't know that we're careful to do that. And we live under a different system. Our principle of giving in the New Testament is not the same as theirs. But for them, it mattered. They should not just tithe the big amounts of income they had, the increase in the size of their flock or something like that. They should tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin. That's why Jesus says at the end of the verse that they should have done these things about justice and mercy and faithfulness without neglecting the others. They should not neglect to tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin. Those things matter. But look at what they didn't pay attention to. These heart issues of justice and mercy and faithfulness. Are they just and righteous in the way they live from day to day? Do they show mercy to people around them who are in need of help, and it's help they can provide? Or do they just kind of ignore that and walk on by? Faithfulness. Are they truly, deeply full of faith in Jesus? Or is it just that they follow the doctrinal issues of the law of Moses? They're careful to tithe everything they get, right down to the mint and the dill and the cumin. Well, with them, that's what it was. They didn't get those heart issues right. That's why Jesus tells them they've neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. They needed to do the doctrinal issues, but the weightier issues, the things more basic to our faith, are these heart issues like justice and mercy and faithfulness. So the externals are important, the things that we do, like the Pharisees, like the Ephesians in Revelation chapter 2, who stood firmly against the Nicolaitans, who called a false apostle, and those other things that the Lord mentions there in Revelation chapter 2. I forgot how I began this sentence now. I'm not able to, Paul, in his writings, he'll start a sentence and go all kinds of places, but then come back to where he started. I sometimes am not that good. Maybe if I were writing, I could look back and see where I began. But my point is that while the Pharisees did those external things, they were failing in regard to these more basic things, these weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Okay. So we heard from Matthew chapter 5 a few minutes ago. Let's go to the other half of Matthew chapter 5. Because we see here Jesus talking about the Pharisees, the rulers of the Jews. He says over and over in this last part of the chapter, speaking to the crowds of Jews, you've heard it said. And he's referring to things that the Pharisees and scribes had said, the lawyers had said, the rulers of the Jews had said. And then Jesus says, but I say to you, because the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers and the rulers of the Jews weren't getting it all right. And so we see several issues here where the Pharisees got a doctrinal issue right, but they didn't get the heart issue right. The first one is that the Pharisees were strict enforcers of the Mosaic law on murder. Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, That's in the law of Moses. That's in the Ten Commandments, in fact. So you've heard that they were told this. And another thing that they have heard, whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. Where did they heard that? Was that in the law of Moses? That line is not in the law of Moses anywhere, but it's what the Pharisees said. God said in the Ten Commandments, you shall not commit murder. Therefore, if you do, we're taking you to court. They took a stand on murder. But, read the next verse, Jesus says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever shall say to his brother, Reka, which means kind of like empty head, or we might say, I don't know if anybody uses this phrase still anymore, but I don't know, 40 years ago, this was, you call someone an airhead, that's this idea of an empty head, which is what Reka means in this verse. Whoever speaks like that to somebody else shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever shall say, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. So the law, murder. The Pharisees stood on that law, enforced that law, but as far as somebody just being hateful, well, they didn't really take a stand on that. Doctrinal issue versus an issue of the heart. Go back to Matthew 23:23. The weightier provision of the law, something like righteousness and mercy, that they were neglecting. Would you say the Pharisees and the rulers of the Jews were sound? No. They got those doctrinal issues right, but those matters of the law, those matters of the heart, those weightier issues, they did not get those things right. In John chapter 9, another thing that we see about the Pharisees is they're just this day for people that they viewed as lower than themselves. How they looked down on other people. John chapter 9, Jesus heals this blind man, gives him sight, and it's the Sabbath day when he does it. And so the Pharisees are very upset by the fact that Jesus had done this on the Sabbath day, and they say this is another evidence that he is not from God. But the blind man, or shall I say the seeing man now, says, well, you can view that as evidence that he's not from God, but he gave me my sight, which is a stronger evidence that he is from God. So they bring him in, and they ask him some questions, and they're not satisfied with his answers, and they don't even believe that he had been born blind. And so they bring in his parents and ask his parents, is this your son, and was he born blind? And they say, yeah, he was born blind. Well, we don't know how he sees. They said that. They knew how he had been given his sight, but they were afraid if they said Jesus did it, that they would be banned from the synagogue. And so they refused to say, well, we don't know. They said, we don't know how he regained his sight. Ask him, he's old enough. So they called him back in, the man who had been healed of his blindness. And we're going to start reading in verse 24. So a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man, Jesus, we know that this man is a sinner. Well, he said, therefore, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, that whereas I was blind, and now I see. Expecting them to be able to draw some conclusions from that, I think. They said, therefore, to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He says to them in verse 27, I told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become his disciples too, do you? And they reviled him. They reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he is from. I love the response of this man who had been blind to that statement. They say, as for this man, we don't know where he's from. Verse 30, the man answered and said to them, well, here's an amazing thing, that you don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. And so on. Verse 33, he says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. That's clear logic. How did the Pharisees respond? Verse 34. They answered and said to him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you teaching us?" And they put him out. They banned him from the synagogue, which his parents feared, and it's why they didn't answer the question. And so he's been put out, banned from the synagogue. But how they speak to him. You were born entirely in sins, and you think that you have something you can teach us? We're the ones who know everything. You're not. The disdain and hatred they had for people that they considered lesser. Such a terrible attitude. They got the external thing right. They got the doctrinal issue right. Don't commit murder. But their hearts were full of hate and disdain. Far from the attitude in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 22. The attitude that Jesus is calling his people to. When he emphasizes, it's not enough just to stand against murder. You also need to stand against this kind of pride and anger and speaking down to people, calling them names. So that's an example there in Matthew chapter 5 of the Pharisees' mistakes when they emphasized only the external things, only the doctrinal things. Another issue, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." The Pharisees taught that. That was something that the crowds of people had heard from the Pharisees and the scribes and the rulers of the Jews. That was also in the law of Moses, also in the Ten Commandments, as a matter of fact. But Jesus wants to respond to that because while they stood against that external thing, that doctrinal thing of the sin of adultery, verse 28, Jesus says to them that everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has committed adultery already in his heart. And I say to you, and if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And so, here's another case. The Pharisees were good at getting the external doctrinal issue right. Adultery is wrong, and they would stand against adultery. But did they have a position on men having lascivious, lustful thoughts in their heart and mind about some woman that they might see? They apparently didn't take a stand on that. Another example here in chapter 5, verse 33. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, "You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord." That's from the Old Testament. That's in the law of Moses. And the Pharisees and the scribes and the rulers of the Jews would say that. And they would take that stand. You make a vow, you have a responsibility to keep that vow. They were right on the doctrinal issue. But Jesus makes some remarks following this, verse 34. "But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king." Why does Jesus respond this way to this issue of vows or oaths? Turn with me, if you will, to Matthew chapter 23 again. This passage we were in a while ago, where Jesus is pronouncing woe upon woe in regard to the scribes and the Pharisees. Chapter 23, verse 16. "Woe to you, blind guides," speaking of scribes and Pharisees, "who say, 'Whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated.'" They played games with the vows. Now, they taught the external issue. You make a vow, you're responsible to keep it. But as far as the inner character of honesty and integrity, no, they were not there at all. Because, you just swore by the temple. You made a deal with this person, and this person made various sacrifices, trusting that you were going to fulfill your end of the deal on this. And now they're suffering because they've lost a lot. When you said you were going to live up to some certain thing that you made this vow about, and you didn't. Oh, you only swore on the temple? No problem. You're not obligated. If you'd sworn by the gold on the temple, then you would have had to fulfill your vow. So they got the external thing, the doctrinal thing right about you got to keep your vows, but then the inner character of honesty and justice and righteousness and mercy, like we read about in verse 23, that wasn't there within them at all. Those weightier matters of the law, they didn't have. The Pharisees measured soundness by externals, without regard to the heart. And we see what Jesus thought of them. Now, for the other part of how I want to address this is to look at Jesus' teaching generally, not just in regard to things he said about the scribes and the Pharisees and the rulers of the Jews, although one of them will be like that, but just generally, what did Jesus teach about? What kinds of things did Jesus teach about? External correctness in regard to doctrinal issues. As we use this phrase, doctrinal issues, I have some issues with that, but or were the things that Jesus generally taught about in his 3 years more these matters of the heart, the character, the integrity, the justice, righteousness, mercy, and faithfulness that he calls the weightier matters of the law? Now again, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying that the doctrinal issues don't matter. Right there in that verse, chapter 23, verse 23, he tells the Pharisees, yes, you had the obligation to tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin. Those doctrinal matters are important, and they matter. But that's not all that matters. There are things that matter beyond those things, and in fact, Jesus calls these other things the weightier matters of the law. So, this question, what did Jesus spend his time teaching about? The doctrinal issues, like as we might think about when we're talking about is a congregation a sound congregation or not, the Lord's Supper every Sunday, marriage and forced remarriage, I forget what all the things I listed at the beginning, singing without instrumental music, those kinds of things. Or did Jesus spend his time talking about matters of the heart, those internal things? And I think we easily see that Jesus taught on the issues of the heart during his 3 years of ministry. And I'll use some examples here. And this first one does have to do directly with the Pharisees. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 7. We see hypocrisy in the Pharisees. They act like righteous men, and I'm sure they thought they were righteous men because they got these external matters right. They got these outward actions right because the law said something about an outward action, and they would get that outward action right, but nevertheless they were hypocritical. Matthew chapter 7, verse 3, and why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, you've got this big trunk of a tree in your own eye? Paraphrasing Jesus there. And behold, the log is in your own eye. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. We see hypocrisy in the Pharisees They acted like they were the righteous ones, that they were the ones that should teach the people, and the people shouldn't try to teach them, like that blind man who tried to simply teach them. Well, if Jesus did this miracle on me, he must be from God. And they reviled him for thinking that he could teach them something. They were hypocritical, criticizing other people's faults when they weren't doing anything about their own. And Jesus spends time teaching about that kind of issue, that kind of hypocrisy, that lack of integrity, that lack of spiritual honesty with yourself and those around you. Or Matthew chapter 13, as we read the parable of the sower, where Jesus draws distinctions between people who receive the gospel and move on with it, versus those who don't truly give themselves to the gospel. So Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. He's told the parable of the sower. You're familiar with this parable. We're going to read Jesus' comments on the parable that he shares with the disciples afterward. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom the seed was sown beside the road. And the one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. The one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, some 30, but they all hold to the word and bring forth fruit in accordance with it. The plant of faith in God is able to grow and prosper in their soul. So what is Jesus talking about here? He's not using issues like whether they have false worship, false forms of worship or not. He's not talking about those who don't believe in baptism. He's not talking about those who are subject to denominations. He's talking about the strength to endure affliction, the devotion that counteracts the influence of wealth, riches, and the worries of the world. They have enough devotion that they make it through those things. That's the kind of things Jesus is talking to his people about in his 3 years of ministry. Or we go to Matthew chapter 13, not the same chapter. Toward the end of the chapter, down to verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. Now, when Jesus talks about what the kingdom is going to be like, is he talking about issues like marriage, divorce, remarriage, or instrumental music, or whether all people or simply men lead in the assemblies of the church? Is he talking about those kinds of issues? Important as they are, what did Jesus spend his 3 years teaching about? The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid, and from joy over it goes and sells all he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and brought it. What's the principle there? That you put finding faith in the Lord and devotion to the Lord, the truth of the Lord, ahead of all those other things. That you're willing to give up any other thing to have an understanding of the truth of God and be devoted to him. I'll give you an example of that. I was able to travel a couple of times to Guatemala. My niece and her husband and their family moved down to Guatemala and worked among brethren there for several years, and I had the privilege to travel down there a couple of times and meet the people there. And I'm going to tell you about Hilmar. Hilmar was a man, I guess in his 30s, maybe 40s. He had a wife and, if I remember well, 3 children. And to get to his house, we walked down this dirt road and then walked down this narrow path through fields of maize and finally came to his house. His house was made out of mud brick. The door was simply a piece of corrugated metal with a couple of boards, I guess 3 boards, if I remember well, maybe in the shape of a Z, to kind of give some stability to that piece of sheet metal. There was one light bulb in the kitchen. The kitchen had bare walls, didn't have cabinets, but at the end of it was, I guess if you envision something like the size of this table, but a little longer, a little wider, and underneath that you could build a fire, and there was a big metal plate across the top of it. That was their stove. There were 2 other rooms in this house. By the way, the roof of the house was corrugated sheet metal with holes in it occasionally. When it rains, you can imagine water coming in through those holes. There were 2 other rooms. One of the rooms I never saw. The other room that I did see, kind of half of it was a living room. Had some plastic chairs like you might use out on a patio, and a very simple table, and a wardrobe. It's a nice old wardrobe, actually, dividing that half of the room from the other half of the room, which was sleeping quarters. And then he took us to a separate building there near the house where he had a loom. I don't know if the meaning of loom would come immediately to mind except for knowing this, but he weaved fabric. The part of the culture among the native Guatemalans is this very colorful fabric that the women would wear. They would make dresses out of this colorful fabric. And he wove that fabric for a living. He didn't make much money doing it. That's why he lived in the circumstances he lived in. He said, I could have gotten a job in the city in an office, and I could have made more money. Could have had a nicer house, had nicer conditions. But I chose this job because it left me more free to be with my family and raise my children, and to take part in the life of the congregation where I am, and the lives of congregations nearby. That's devotion. That's devotion of the kind that Jesus is talking about when he talks about someone who sees a treasure, the gospel, and wants that, is devoted to that, and is willing to give up all the other things in order to have that. He loved the gospel. Still does. I don't mean to speak of him in the past tense. And he would give up anything he needed to give up in order to advance the cause of that which he truly loved, the gospel. That's the kind of person, that's the kind of quality, that's that kind of inward quality, that kind of love for the Lord, that kind of integrity in the heart that Jesus is spending his time teaching about here at the end of Matthew chapter 13 in verses 44 and following. John chapter 13, we'll just notice another passage where Jesus is spending some time teaching, and notice what kind of thing he's teaching about. John chapter 13, this is the night before the crucifixion. He's with the disciples, and he begins to wash the feet of the disciples. There are several lessons here, but we won't take time to notice them all. But in verse 12, when he's finished this, he asked them, do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher in the Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord, and the teacher washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should do as I did to you. He's teaching them about humility and love for one another and service to one another. Humility, love, service, those inward qualities of the heart. We see people in churches who are really good at this kind of thing, who think about what their fellow Christians need, what their brethren need, and step up and do those things. And that's what's on their mind during the week, and so that's what they do. Preached a lesson several months ago here on Aquila and Priscilla and how they served, and everywhere they went, they were serving others and having the church meet in their home. How they stood up for Paul and risked their own necks for his life. People who serve. So, I'm not saying Jesus doesn't care about the doctrinal issues. He does. He says, he tells the disciples, I've taught you what I've taught you, and I'm going to send the Holy Spirit to you, and he'll lead you into all truth. Things that they weren't ready for yet, but he had been emphasizing in that first stage of their faith, in these 3 years, the weightier matters of the law. Righteousness, mercy, faithfulness. Those other things are important. They matter. We cannot kind of sacrifice the doctrinal things and say, oh, well, maybe they're not so important after all. No, they are. But more basic to our faith. The weightier matters of the law. Righteousness, mercy, faithfulness. The kind of issues that Jesus spent those 3 years talking about as he introduced them to a real faith in God and in service to Christ. So, a sound congregation. Is there a sound congregation in that city over there? Oh, yeah, there's one. It's a sound congregation, but they're kind of dead. Then they're not sound. They're not sound. They may get the doctrinal issues right, if they don't have the weightier matters of the law right, if they don't have the matters of the heart right, if they don't have the righteousness and mercy and faithfulness right, they're not sound. Well, my concern when I preach this here, and I preach this in other places, my concern is not so much how do you evaluate congregations over there or over there. How do we evaluate ourselves? Are we saved? Do we get the weightier matters of the law right? Or do we judge only on, well, I come to church every time, and I would like it if they stopped having the Lord's Supper every Sunday. I'd stand up and say, we've got to have the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Are we like the Ephesians in Revelation chapter 2, who hated the deeds of the Nicolaitans, and they called a false apostle, and a number of other external things, but had left their first love? Or like the Laodiceans, who are just lukewarm now. Those weightier matters of the law are just as important as the doctrinal things, and they are more basic to our faith and our service to God. So I end with the question, are we saved? Are you saved? Is your heart where it ought to be? I encourage you to think on those things. I think those are things that Christians throughout the centuries need to have on their hearts and think about those things, those issues, those matters. If you have need this evening, would you come as we stand and sing?
What can wash away